Just by way of introduction, I'm going to be talking about the Pisa study. You might have already heard of this. It's a study which is a comparison of educational standards across different countries in the world. Pisa is actually an acronym. It stands for Programme for International Student Assessment. And I think the only thing that I might need to mention beforehand is that it's carried out by the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And I'll begin. The Pisa study is the most important study on international educational standards. And in this speech today, I'm going to first of all describe the Pisa study, what it is, how it works, and who carries it out. I'll also have a look at the most recent results of this study, and I'll be focusing in particular on the UK. I'll think about some lessons which might be drawn from the results of the study, and again I'll focus on the UK. And I'll also consider some of the criticisms which have actually been levelled at this study. The first Pisa study was carried out in the year 2000, and the results were then published in 2001. The Pisa study takes place every 3 years, and the most recent results were published in 2013. The Pisa study is governed and it's coordinated by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. It's an extremely high-profile study. It really does wield quite a lot of influence. Whenever the results of the study are published, there tends to be a lot of press coverage, there are lots of articles in newspapers, there's a lot of discussion in the media, and countries tend to really take that opportunity to look closely at their own educational policies and how successful or not they are. For the Pisa study, the OECD looks at over 500,000 pupils across a variety of countries, in fact over 65 different countries, and it looks at pupils' level in 3 different areas, in reading, maths and science. So out of 65 countries that were assessed, the UK came 26th in maths, the UK came 23rd in reading and 21st in science. And this was very similar to its previous performance in 2009. So the UK it's in the mid-20s out of 65 countries. So you could say that the UK it's middle of the pack. It's by no means a star pupil, but it's not a problem child either. But nevertheless, the results of the most recent study were very poorly received in the UK. Commentators in the press were saying that UK education was stagnating. They were saying that UK pupils were lagging behind their international rivals. And I remember one headline which was that UK students were stuck in the educational doldrums. So it all sounded extremely negative. The top places in the rankings in the most recent study were dominated by Asian school systems, and if I remember correctly, the top 3 places were occupied by Shanghai, Singapore and Hong Kong. And incidentally, if you're wondering why Shanghai and Hong Kong appear as opposed to China, it's because China is not yet assessed as a country in its entirety. It's only represented by certain individual cities which are assessed. And these individual cities happen to be very high performing in terms of education, Shanghai and Hong Kong. In terms of the performance of European countries, Finland was for a long time considered the educational superpower across the entire world, in fact. Finland occupied the top spot for several years in this study, and it's still very much looked upon as a model of a successful education system. It's true, Finland, in the last study, it did slip down a few places. It didn't come quite as high, but nevertheless, Finland was still the best performing European country. So thinking again about the UK's performance, how might we improve the education system? How might we overcome some of the supposed problems which UK education is facing? Well, these are just my own personal observations. These aren't really scientifically backed observations found in any study or anything like that. Just my own personal points. The first point, I think, is that the status of the teaching profession needs to be improved. I think teaching is an extremely difficult job. It's a job which entails a heavy burden of responsibility. And I think given how great a responsibility teachers assume, they're not sufficiently well paid. And I also don't think that they enjoy sufficient respect or status, at least in the UK. Now, hopefully increasing pay for teachers and improving the status of the profession would lead to better motivated teachers, and it would hopefully help to attract greater numbers to the teaching profession. And the second point I'd like to make is about financing of education, because typically to resolve any sort of problem, money tends to come into it somewhere, and education is no exception. But in fact, at present, the UK spends a lot of money on average when you compare it to other countries. And I'll just give you a couple of statistics to demonstrate this point. For every individual pupil, over their lifespan from the age of 5 to 15, the UK, on average, spends £59,889. And when you compare this to the average across OECD member countries, this average is only £50,951. So the UK is actually already spending quite a lot of money. So the problem is not the amount of money. I think that perhaps, though, that the money needs to be better, it needs to be targeted to where it's really needed. Resources need to be devoted to those schools which really need it, because in the UK there's quite a gap between very high-performing schools with excellent results and, on the other hand, schools which are struggling and which have a lot of pupils in difficulty. So as I was saying, the Pisa study really does wield a lot of influence. It tends to be called upon by politicians when they want to make certain changes to educational policy. But educational researchers have, in the past, brought certain criticisms to the Pisa study, and I'll go through a few of these criticisms. The first criticism is that the Pisa study is too short-term in its outlook. It tends to encourage a very short-term focus on climbing the league tables, on climbing the rankings, and it tends to therefore lead to focus on just preparing for the Pisa tests. But to bring about any change in education, this really is a much more long-term project, long-term process typically, and changes can take years or even decades to come to fruition. And the next criticism is that people say that it tends to focus too narrowly on quantifiable aspects of education, on things which are easily measurable, compared to a more broader view of education, which might include notions of personal development and artistic aspects of education, for example. And perhaps most importantly, the methodology of this study has been heavily criticised in the past. Statisticians have looked at the model which is used, and they found it to be fundamentally flawed. And a lot of statisticians in the past have said that the study's methodology simply isn't robust enough, and certainly not robust enough for politicians to be basing very important decisions about education on, which affect very large numbers of pupils across the world. Despite these criticisms, in conclusion, I do feel that Pisa is a valid undertaking. I think that it helps to highlight the systems which work best across different countries in the world. Of course, we need to bear in mind that the PISA results are not 100% reliable. We need to treat them with a little bit of caution. We need to take them with a pinch of salt. But I think that PISA does help to highlight reforms that might be necessary in individual countries. And as far as the UK is concerned, I think the most pressing reforms are the need to increase teachers' pay and to improve the status of the teaching profession. And secondly, to make more efficient use of financial resources in order to bridge the gap between the very high-performing schools on the one hand and underperforming schools on the other. Thank you very much for your attention.